try a drop of naphtha under there. That may lift off very easily, or it may not, depending on how many layers of gunk it's got here. Right, that label's not exactly flat. Let's see if we can get that flattened out a bit better. Yeah, so the label's bent out of shape. Now someone here has used the traditional method of prying it up. They've poked a needle down at the end and levered, but it's got too much adhesive on it. So 4 screws hold the front plate in place. While I'm here, let's lift out that pinion. That little idler there can come off, and that pinion can come out. That couples through to the meter drum. We have 4 screws. Okay, so 3 we can see. These screws are quite loose. There's no real good reason for that. The shutter should lift off. Here we go. So there's the front plate with the shutter attached. It's not uncommon for these 4 screws to be loose. That one was loose, that's loose, that's loose, that's loose. Now when they come loose, the whole front of the shutter here comes loose on the plate. There's another round of screws which actually hold stuff together inside there. So there's our shutter assembly anyway, it's a separate piece. And here you can see what's happened to the meter cord. The meter cord here has dropped off that pulley. It should have been round there, and it's popped over the top, and that's why the meter had stopped working. Let's just check and make sure that that's the only problem. Yeah, it is by the looks of it, because there's the other knot at the end. So if I pull that meter cord through, we have our complete meter cord, knots at both ends and unbroken, and in apparently good condition. This is the drum that the meter cord wraps around. Okay, so let's start peeling some more stuff off. This is the arm that couples the rangefinder, and this is the arm that couples the frame finder. This lot's held in with 2 screws here and 1 screw here, and there's usually a couple of tiny washers in there at the pivot points for the rangefinder arm. These screws are loose. Right, taking this apart, we can swing this arm out and lift it off, that plate, and lift the arm out. I'm not seeing any washers, top or bottom, on that arm. Normally there are 2. Here's the shaft that couples from the cocking rack to the shutter. This plastic baffle's quite important. Now what am I not seeing? I'm not seeing the washers that should have sat here, these spacer washers. There should have been 8 or 12 washers, and their job, now there's that little washer I mentioned from the rangefinder, there's one of them. Right, so there should have been 8 or 12 of those spacer washers. Now their job's very important. They provide tension underneath the front plate so that you can adjust the position of the front plate relative to the film plane at the back of the camera. And that's quite important, because otherwise you won't get your lenses to focus the image on the film correctly. Now we have one washer. Now one washer is not enough. So we're short 7 or 11 washers there. That's interesting. Now those washers can't escape by themselves. Someone would have to go to the trouble of removing those 4 screws, all of them, and either getting in and doing whatever they hoped to do, or backing out and deciding they weren't going to achieve anything. Given the way the Leatherettes were glued back onto this, I think somebody must have made an attempt to do a repair. Okay, let's carry on anyway. The rewind button next, I think. I've got a special pair of pliers for that. And they were made by taking a cheap pair of needle nose pliers, cutting the tips off, sticking that thing in the vise and drilling into it with a succession of different size drills until I had the whole size I wanted. Now this spring is important. That comes off this arm here, and basically it just acts to give it a bit of tension to push it forward. Got a small screw here which couples the sprocket shaft to the sprocket wheel. We poke that through, lift out the shaft. There's our sprocket. At the base of the camera, this is the latch for the rewind button. Is this thing going to focus? Unhook that spring, remove that screw, and lift out that latch. Yeah, that latch just locks the rewind button in place until you move the film advance lever again. And we have 3 screws hold our film advance shaft into the body. Just turning this around so that I can see the screws through the hole in the plate, or the 3 holes in the plate. And these screws are not even loose. This doesn't, oh that one was. This doesn't move very smoothly. It might be pretty gummed up with dried grease. Yeah, it is. That grease has sort of gone to, it's like tar now. Recover those screws. And from the top of the camera, this is the guide bush for the top of the film advance. It's got a little gear set on the top, which is also quite stiff. This is the clutch. The clutch's job is to provide some slippage between the take-up spool and the sprocket so that it doesn't tear your film to pieces. And there is our take-up spool, a little metal bush in the base. And that's about it. I've got a nice big pile of stuff here that used to be a Retina IIIS, and now I have to start cleaning this stuff up and put it back together. Oh, another little point of interest, this baffle is supposed to be sitting in here nice and square. That tab's supposed to be sitting up in that little cutout. This one's supposed to be sitting down in that cutout. As you can see, it's not. That means that that baffle would have been covering some of the film plane. It should have been sitting down in that position there. And that's where it'll have to be held in place with a little spot of glue, and I'm reassembling it. So here we have the shutter assembly from the camera number 2 of the Retina IIIS cameras that I'm servicing. The shutter sort of works reasonably well, but it certainly needs to be serviced. Now, from memory, when I checked this, yes, these screws were loose. These 4 screws are not uncommonly loose on a 3S camera. Now, camera number 1's got a rattle in it. We can't seem to get the screw to rattle out and come out of the camera, so most likely it's trapped inside the back of the camera. It's trapped inside here, and it's most likely one of these 4 screws. So I want to take this plate off and disconnect this flash contact here. This little piece here, this is our rangefinder coupling and the frame selector coupling. There's a little collet on the back. Pull that off. This piece goes on the back, and if I can get this to come out nicely. Right, so we have 4 pieces in total. There we go. That's what we're looking for. 4 pieces of brass and 1 steel pin make up this coupling. So I'll just pop those back together. As they'd sit in the camera. And I can put those to one side where they won't get lost. That pin in particular is quite thin. If you break it, it's going to be a problem. I may have mentioned previously these 4 screws were loose. That's not uncommon. Now, the 4 screws that hold the shutter body here to the front plate are visible through holes here, here, here and here. So I'll see if I can get them loose. It's not always easy to get your screwdriver onto these screws. That screw was loose. This one in particular, you may have to cock the shutter to bring the cocking gear around to a point where you can get at that. That screw is missing. And that screw is loose. So we have 3 of the 4 screws. One of them has gone AWOL. Well, one of those screws is quite possibly what's rattling around in the back of camera number 1. Oh, there's our screw. No, it's not. That's another one again. That's a different screw from somewhere else. Our flash contact here, that's come off. That I didn't even have to undo the screw, that just came off. There's a little plastic collar here with a screw in at the side. Now, I didn't even need to loosen it. Okay, so we've got a stray screw here, and we are missing one of these 4 screws. I've already taken out the rangefinder coupling stuff here. We have 4 pieces of brass and a steel pin, and I've put them back together in the order they came out so I don't lose them. Okay, so this screw, where's that come from? Well, that screw's come from this position, and it's just rattled loose. Let's have a look at the front of the camera here first. We've got the 4 screws here that held that shutter mount onto this plate, and these screws were loose. One of these screws is also a possibility as being the culprit on camera number 1 for the rattle. Now let's see if this will lift apart for us. Now I'm going to need to take these screws out of this chrome trim first and lift that off. I'm not sure why this is so sticky. It might be glue holding it down around the edges. No, it's coming away now. Okay. So there's our chrome trim with the flash contact on it, and it's still got that little contact on there that I didn't even need to unscrew. It just came straight off the camera. Pop these screws away that are running away as fast as they can. There's our chrome plate. This needs a bit of cleaning, but otherwise it's okay. This little thing here, where's it gone? A film chip. Here it is. That's a film chip. That's one of the torn off pieces of film from between the film that goes over the sprockets on your camera. That little film chip there, one of them is quite capable excuse me, of jamming a camera like this. It gets in somewhere it shouldn't be and jams some action and things stop working. So this is just a plain piece of aluminium. It's all nicely machined. It's also very filthy and covered in stuff. This piece should clean up reasonably well. They're often a little bit corroded around the edges. If it's not too bad, just clean it, put it back. You can paint them if you so desire. This is our adjustment wheel for the meter. This stuff doesn't come apart. It's all riveted together. This is where the cocking action for the shutter happens. And here we have the shutter itself. Now we've already got one screw of the 4 fixing screws has already fallen out. And it was that one there. You can take its mates out. Just checking it was the right screw. Yes, it appears it was. This one's loose. So we've got a few loose screws with this camera. We've only got 3 to worry about. Yes, okay, there's only 3 to worry about. Okay, so at the front here, this is our lens mount basically. Now there's a little detent ball in here. Be aware of that and don't lose it. Otherwise your shutter will not have detents. You won't get the nice click, click, click between when you change the speeds. This is the lens mount here, the bayonet. That's where it bayonets in. And you can see the little tensioning springs on the back of that. Let's pop those 3 screws aside. And here is the shutter. Now the shutter is very, very similar to the shutter on a Retina Reflex 3 or a Retina Reflex S camera. It lacks certain pieces because obviously it doesn't need to open the blades for viewing. But it's also very similar to a Voigtlander Vito Vitessa T camera. So this shutter will need to be stripped right down and serviced. I'm looking at the state of that. Those blades aren't too bad. You can certainly see some marking on them. They could probably benefit from a clean. In a camera like this, where the shutter blades are open to the atmosphere, albeit the inside of the camera body, you don't tend to suffer from the same amount of oiling on the blades that you would see on a shutter that is trapped between a front and rear lens group. But it needs to be stripped and cleaned all the same. So we'll get on to that next. So here is the shutter. Now the shutter on this camera, because the aperture control and everything is on the lens, the aperture's on the lens, we have no aperture blades in the shutter. So let's take this apart. So we need to get this ring off the front here. Normally you can just get the tip of your tweezers into one of those holes and push that thing to one side. I'll rotate that ring slightly so we can get it somewhere useful. Can I see anything here? Not today. Some of these rings have a little groove in the back of them, and if you can line that up, you can hook your tip of your tweezers in there easier. That'll do. We're in. Oh, that's what I was looking for, those things. But basically that's just a spring clip that holds things in place. This is the shutter speed settings cam plate. These little notches at the top here, they give us your detents for your shutter speeds. They act against that ball that I mentioned earlier. Here is where the speeds are set on the retard gear train. This pin on the retard gear train follows those little rises and falls there. Okay, so this is the little pinion that cocks the shutter and also cocks the main spring. I call this piece the internal cocking ring. Basically that gets cocked by that mechanism and it latches things into place, latches the shutter in the ready to fire position. This is the main spring for the main cam, and this one is very tired. It's as tired as they get. If you count, this is sitting at 12 o'clock, that pin's coming up at about the 4 o'clock position. That's very tired. That means that had very little tension at the fully closed position, and it means that if the shutter blades or the shutter mechanism is even slightly sticky with old age and dried grease, you end up with a situation where the blades might not close completely. This is the main cam. The shutter release here can lift out. Yeah, I'm not convinced that that was popped back in the right place there. That usually has quite a bit of tension on it. Normally with these in the Compur shutters, this little return spring here simply sits on the inside of the case at this point. On these shutters it gets pulled all the way around and traps in against this piece, which gives it much more tension. That one didn't appear to me to be sitting in the right place. This serves to act, that latches the main cam in position, and when you release the shutter, that pulls back and the shutter main cam's able to rotate. So we'll remove that. This piece underneath it is the flash sync mechanism. That allows you to set the flash sync speed to suit electronic flash on the X position or bulb flash on the M position. Now I've got to be careful here, I've got a loose spring there. Be careful not to lose that spring. The other screw fell in here and I can pull that back out. So that plate should lift off. Here's the moving flash contact. I'll unhook these pieces now. This piece sort of arms the flash sync stuff. It's just trapped under that spring there. Sometimes they're a bit awkward to get up. That spring might be pushed across a bit far. That's better, we got it out. Need to stretch this spring out enough to unhook it from that point. Now, normally what I do with that is, if you just grab hold of the spring and start stretching it out, what tends to happen is that the arm just moves with you. So you're chasing a moving target, you can't get the thing unhooked. So what I'd normally do is put a screwdriver behind that so the arm can't swing out of the way. And if I grab the spring, I've only got to move it the slightest amount to unhook it from that arm. This little sector gear should lift out. Here's the little wheel that drives the pallets, and that gives us that rundown timing. So that when you release the shutter, when it's set to the M setting, the first thing that happens is it fires the flash rather, and when that thing runs down, it releases the shutter. There's a few springs here we need to get rid of. Let's get rid of the speed trains first. Here's the self timer, or the delay action. It's held in with a single screw. Let's see if we can get that to lift out nicely. That arm there, that slot in the arm of that fits over a pin. The pin is hooked to this piece here. And this is the retard gear train. Now if you're taking this out of your camera, there are two screws to undo, and don't undo the other one or you'll be in deep trouble. This one at the end, remove that. Down here in this position, there's another one. Goes right down at the back. Remove that. This one at this position, leave it alone. If you undo that, the speed train will come apart. They are no fun to put back together. It can be done, you don't want to be doing it. Okay, so we've got the speed trains out. This is the B lever. The screw here holds the B lever in position, and it also holds this spring, which activates the B lever and acts against that post, that bright post you see in there that's hooked up to this control. So we take that screw out. Take the B lever off. We have one spring here. Now this spring is very, very good at getting away. What I do to try and avoid it pinging across the room and getting lost forever is hold a toothpick over the centre so there's nowhere for it to go. Use my tweezers to lift up one end and unhitch it, and then I can lift the spring out. That's what the spring looks like. And be very careful with it. I don't have lots of spares. In fact, I'm very lucky if I can find one when I need it. In fact, I think all the spares I've got are sitting in complete shutters at the moment. So that one, as I say, it's easily lost, and I've lost plenty. And so has everyone else who's ever worked on these things. Right, this plate at the back, this is the latch that stops you moving the lever to set the self timer or changing your flash sync speed. That's the latch for it. 3 screws hold this on the back. Now you'll be very carefully laying out these screws in separate containers with the piece that they held down, along with notes and photos and so forth, so that you know exactly which screws went where. I'm not, because I'm lazy and I've never done things like that. But you should be. Do as I say, not as I do. This is the setting lever for the self-timer and the flash sync. This is the pin that pulls the self-timer, cocks the self-timer mechanism when you swing this across. Okay, so here we've just got the base shutter now. No more springs to be lost. And this has got our shutter blades in it. Now the shutter blades, as you will see, you may be expecting there to be 5 shutter blades. There are not 5 shutter blades. There are 6 shutter blades. And there are 6 shutter blades because one of them is called a cover blade. And the cover blade's job, it just adds a little bit of security. Cameras with fixed lenses. The angle that the light can strike those shutter blades is deeply controlled by whatever lens is on the front of the camera. So the light rays have to strike pretty much straight up and down into the shutter. So it's not hard to block the light travelling through where you don't want it. If you've got a camera that you can remove the shutter from, then light rays could hit the shutter at an angle like this, for example, while you've got the lens off the front of the camera. And that might mean that you get some light passed down between the edges of the blades. Now if you've got a cover blade in place, that blocks that little option of the blade, the light getting out easily. So cover blades are not uncommonly seen where you have an interchangeable lens camera. Okay, so I'll just pop that to one side. So here's our case. As you can see, there are no diaphragm blades in here, so there's virtually nothing to do with this case. All you have to do with this is clean it, but what I always do is check to make sure that these 3 screws that hold that plate in place are tight. Now should one of those screws loosen up, it could back out and it would foul one of these blades and stop the shutter from working. They're all good. That all looks fine. So that shutter housing just needs to be cleaned. That's okay. Here we have the blades. Now I should have started with this and the blades in the open position so we could unstack it easily. Too late now. Okay, so here's blade number 6. The last one that gets laid in place. That goes over exactly the same position as blade number 1. This would be blade number 5, blade number 4, and the others are all falling in. Blade number 3, blade number 2 is a different shape, and blade number 1 is the same as most of the others. Notice blade number 2. This is one of the common blades. 1, 3, 4 or 5. This is blade number 2. Blade number 2's got a steep cutout in the back of the blade at this point, and that's so that it can pull back past this point where the pin comes through on that pinion. So that pinion comes up through the camera there, and this needs to be there so that it can pull back past that point. Let's get this thing on here in the right place. Where are we? There. No, wrong way. Yeah, I'll show you that in a second. Let me get this thing in the open position. That's better. The blade's open position would be there. And in the blade's open position, you can see that this blade comes back right to that post. Now obviously if you had a blade that didn't have the cutout there, it wouldn't go. In fact, you could only open it about this far. So if you end up with a shutter that doesn't open all the way after you've assembled it, there's a very good chance that you've got one of the blades in the wrong place. So be aware, that's blade number 2. The other 4 main blades are all the same, and this one here is the cover blade, blade number 6. Okay, so enough of that. Let's tip those blades out. They looked okay. One of them had looked like it was a little bit bent, which might suggest that someone had poked at the shutter from the front. Why people do things like that is one of life's secrets. Taking this apart, what we want to do is take this apart so we can remove the blade actuating ring. That's this piece here, and the blade actuating ring moves to swing the pivot. Their blades are all pivoted on these posts, and this piece here couples to the other hole in the blade and swings the blades open and closed. The 3 screws hold down the tube in the middle, which is called the lens tube. The 3 screws look all the same, but one of them is slightly longer than its mates. Oh, these screws are tight too. With screws, particularly tight screws, you need to keep an awful lot of downward pressure on your screwdriver so it can't cam out. Now this little bracket here holds the main spring. That's what holds back the main drive spring for the drive cam. And that's held down by one of those 3 screws. Now that screw is slightly longer than its 2 mates. It's about 1/4 millimetre in it, and it's very important. So here's our lens tube. Here's our blade actuating ring. Now that revolves around the brass lens tube. And this little spring here is the detent. Now the camera just cut off there, reached a file size limit. I was just saying the detent spring here. Its job is to keep the blade actuating ring from flopping about. Basically it serves to make sure that the blade actuating ring stays parked in the blade's closed position until it's driven by the main cam to open and close the blades. You don't want it rattling loose or rattling open and exposing your film when you don't want it. So that's what that job is. So all of these pieces need to be cleaned, and I hope that you've got yours all neatly labelled so that you can find things and you know where everything goes. I haven't, but then I never have done. It used to drive my boss mad when I first started at Kodak. I've never mended my ways.